America has often been called the land of opportunity. And the question becomes, opportunity for what? For a lot of people, America was the place to make more money, to escape persecution, to enjoy political freedom, and one way or another to build a better life for themselves. Even today, when we have our issues with the rest of the world, America still stands out as sort of a shining beacon to millions upon millions of people, a place where anything is possible. At no time in our history was this belief more true than in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. We saw immigration at levels that we had never seen before and will most likely never see again. So where did all these people come from? The great majority was from Europe. Between 1870 and 1920, we saw roughly 20 million people pack up from Europe and leave for the United States. And that came in kind of two sections. The first was 1870 to 1890. We saw immigrants come from the United Kingdom, England, Ireland, to a lesser degree Scotland, and then a little bit in Central Europe, primarily Germany. These immigrants were primarily Protestant Christian, were light-skinned, and generally fit fairly easily into American culture. The Irish immigrants were a little bit of an exception, but that's something we'll take a look at a little bit later in the course. Following 1890, we saw immigration shift to the south and to the east. Immigrants now came from Italy, the states of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and somewhat as well Russia. These immigrants tended to have religious differences. They were Roman Catholic and they were Jewish. They tended to be darker skinned and have deeper cultural differences than the Northern and Central Europeans before them. That was going to eventually lead to some problems for these people. Why did people come? A variety of reasons. One of them was poverty. There simply were not economic opportunities in Europe at this point in time. Another was crowding. The population of Europe roughly doubled between 1800 and 1900. As you guys know, Europe, land-wise compared to the United States, is not that big. So a doubling in population is going to mean we're going to have a lot more people on what seems to be increasingly smaller amount of land. A lack of jobs. Again, if we have all these extra people who need jobs, we're not going to have anywhere to put them. There's only so much that people need at any given point in time. Religious persecution, especially of the Jews in Russia. They're what we call pogroms, state-sponsored riots against the Jews. We saw other religious differences and persecutions take place in Europe throughout this time period as well. Famine, or lack of food. We saw drought take hold in Europe a couple of times, and what that did was it killed off a lot of crops, so it left people hungry. And finally, and certainly not least, political reform. As the 1800s went on, we still saw some of the old-style monarchies and things like that in Europe. At this point in time, the United States had been the leading beacon of democracy throughout the world, and people saw that opportunity and wanted that opportunity here in America. Immigration from Asia, and this is not going to be anywhere near on the scale that we saw from Europe. From 1851 to 1883, we saw 200,000 people immigrate from Asia. By 1920, we saw an additional 200,000. Now, that's 400,000 people. That's a lot of people. But again, let's compare that real quickly to the 20 million we saw from Europe. Why did people come from Asia? Same reasons they came from Europe. Closer to home, we saw immigration from Central and South America as well. Almost 250,000 people from the West Indies came to the United States between 1880 and 1920. We saw a huge inflow from Mexico as the Mexican political situation became rather unstable. And then we had the passing of something called the Newlands Act. The Newlands Act was going to irrigate or bring water into the southwest United States. What that would do is turn the desert into farmland. What that did then is it increased the demand for farm workers. Roughly 1 million people came from Mexico in order to seek a better opportunity for life in the United States. I want to take a look at this chart real quickly to show you immigration to the United States. A couple of things that are interesting. If you take a look, right around the 1880s when industrialization really takes off, we see a sharp spike in immigration. That peaks just about the early 1900s to about 1910, falls off gradually, and then drops out during the Depression and World War II. One thing that's kind of interesting is that we see it go back up again following World War II, which shows you that, again, America remains an attractive destination for people throughout the 20th century. Now let's go back to the late 1800s and early 1900s. And let's take a look at a typical immigrant's journey to America. Most people would go by steamship. Now, if we take a look at the steamship here, that doesn't look so bad. And for the passengers on the top level, it wasn't. It certainly wouldn't be the most pleasant thing you've ever endured, but you would have a fairly nice room with a view, food you could tolerate, so on down the line. Most immigrants, however, were in a part of the ship called steerage. Steerage was the area below the waterline on the ship. As you can see from this picture, it is not a very pleasant place to be. It was cramped. If you take a look at those bunks, we would be fitting, I would guess, probably 2 or 3 people to each section there. Some ships even made you bring your own bedding. It would be dark. Again, there weren't windows once the boat got going. It would smell. On average, there was 1 toilet for every 100 people. There would be spoiled food. It would be very stuffy down there, again, because you couldn't get ventilation. In some cases, water even seeped in if the boat hit rocky seas. So for a lot of people, if they could, they actually would take their blankets and go sit on the deck of the ship. It would be cold, it would be windy, it would be wet, but it beat being down in steerage where they were. The destination for most European immigrants was Ellis Island. Ellis Island was located outside of New York City. Why did we do that? Well, we were afraid of disease. There had been several epidemics of various things we didn't want here in America. So if a shipload of immigrants came over that were sick, we wanted to be able to make sure that epidemic didn't spread into the United States. Ellis Island was often called the Island of Tears in Europe because there was this great fear that you would be sent home. Most people who immigrated spent everything they had to get to America. Here we have a group of immigrants at Ellis Island. What you see them carrying is all they have. So we have 2 small bundles of what I would assume would be clothing, maybe a couple of family valuables. They had the clothes that they were wearing, and that was really it. Most people spent close to their last dollar. The steamship's passage was very, very expensive. So this was a huge risk. If you were denied entry into America, you would be sent back to Europe with nothing. Maybe the few things that you had with you. Now, what happened to the immigrants once they got to Ellis Island? A lot of waiting. Generally, immigrants would be sent into the Great Hall, which we see pictured here. And you can see down at the bottom, we have big, long queues for people to wait in. People wait for several things. Inspection of documents, medical examinations, interviews, so on down the line. Despite what looks like the chaos there, most immigrants were at Ellis Island for less than 8 hours. What we see here is an eye examination. This would be part of the medical exam process. In this case, they're looking for a disease called trachoma, which was highly contagious that we wanted to keep out. This was really kind of a physical examination by assembly line. So the guy checking the eyes here, that's all he did all day. And these immigrants would go from station to station to station to be inspected. Following the medical examinations, again, there might be a quick inspection of documents or interview. And then the immigrants you see pictured here would be set up to be processed to be sent out into the United States. Despite the immigrant fears, only 2% of people at Ellis Island were ever sent home. The immigration station itself processed roughly 16 million people during its existence. And by some estimates, 1 out of every 4 Americans is here today because of somebody who passed through Ellis Island. The opposite of Ellis Island was Angel Island. This was in San Francisco. Whereas in Ellis Island, we wanted to let people in. We were generally fairly friendly to European immigration. Angel Island was really designed to keep people out. There was widespread opposition to immigration from Asia, especially in the West, and we'll get into why in a little bit. Angel Island was designed to make sure that these undesirables, quote unquote, didn't get into the country. In contrast to Ellis Island, where 16 million people got in, only 50,000 got through Angel Island. As you can see, it was a complex of old buildings, and long detentions, an average of 3 months, were common. Interviews, as we see here, could take days as opposed to the few minutes that we saw at Ellis Island. We also saw a physical examination, much like we saw over at Ellis. Now, once people got here, they had a variety of challenges. They didn't speak the language. They had to find a place to live. They had to find a job. So what happened was we started to see in major American cities, ethnic neighborhoods pop up. And when people immigrated, they knew if you came to Cleveland, this is where the Polish immigrants live. This is where the Irish immigrants live. This is where the Czech immigrants live, and so on down the line. And what that did then was it allowed people to find their way around and find some of the comforts of home. We saw people build churches as they knew back home. Social clubs and aid societies, which kept alive the old country traditions and also helped newcomers. Even newspapers in people's native languages so they were able to follow what was going on. As time went on and more immigrants came into the United States, saw the rise of something called nativism. Nativism was a preference for native-born Americans over immigrants. Kind of ironic when you consider the nativists themselves descended from immigrants. Why did they want to keep people out? Well, the number one reason was money. As more immigrants came, there was a fear in America that the immigrants would take all of, quote-unquote, our jobs. People saw their livelihoods threatened. Part of it was religious. The new immigrants were bringing new and frightening religions into the United States. Part of it as well was a little bit of ethnic prejudice or racism, depending on where the immigrants were. They didn't look right. They didn't dress right. They didn't talk right. So on down the line. So we saw a lot of anti-immigrant societies pop up. One was called the Immigration Restriction League. The Immigration Restriction League, as its name might suggest, wanted to limit immigration to desirable individuals. In other words, people who were wealthy, people who were Protestant Christian, people who were white, so on down the line. As you guys see in the cartoon here, their goal was to keep the door closed in all but a few very specific cases. These restrictions tended to follow economic conditions. If the economy was good, the door was open. If it wasn't, the door was closed. Two extreme examples of this were the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentlemen's Agreement. The Chinese Exclusion Act was what it sounds like. It was a law passed to keep Chinese immigrants from coming into the United States. And in fact, if you were from China, you were not allowed to come into the United States unless your stay was only going to be temporary. This law lasted until 1943, when we were allies in World War II. The Gentlemen's Agreement was similar, worked out between President Roosevelt and the Emperor of Japan, which essentially said that the Emperor of Japan would discourage people from Japan immigrating into the United States, and in return, the United States would desegregate public schools in California. They had started to set up separate Asian and American schools. So this informal agreement between the two sides limited immigration and also did end that discrimination.